Bay of Biscay, March 1944. Dawn broke under a low ceiling of gray cloud as U-976 plowed eastward toward the safety of Saint-Nazaire. On her conning tower stood Captain Lieutenant Hans-Dieter Hankey, a veteran of 37 patrols, confident that his boat could always escape Allied aircraft by diving beneath the sea. German doctrine had drilled it into every submariner. Water was the best armor. No shell could penetrate more than a few centimeters before losing velocity, and once beneath the surface, the U-boat was untouchable. But that morning, the doctrine was about to die. Two specks appeared on the horizon, fast and low, their twin engines driving them closer with a steady, ominous hum. Mosquitoes, the wooden wonders that Luftwaffe pilots had once mocked as furniture with wings. Yet these were not ordinary mosquitoes. They were FB-Mk-8, the Setse variant, armed not with rockets or bombs, but with a single weapon that no U-boat captain had ever faced: the 57mm Moulins cannon, mounted in the nose like the sting of an insect scaled into steel. Inside the Setse, Flight Officer Turner lined up his gun sight as the navigator called out speed and range. They had rehearsed this attack dozens of times, learning that success depended on one merciless truth: the submarine had only 18 seconds to escape once sighted. That was the narrow window between the lookout's warning cry and the moment the first 57mm shell punched through the sea. Hankey, trusting his training, shouted the order to crash dive, convinced that 60 centimeters of seawater above the hull would shield him from harm. The Mosquito closed in at a perfect angle, its wooden frame steady despite the weight of the cannon. Turner's finger tightened on the trigger. At that instant, everything the Germans believed about the sea's protection would be tested. The first round left the barrel at nearly 900 meters per second, aimed directly at the dark shape of U-976 sliding beneath the surface. The first 57mm shell struck 20 meters ahead of U-976's bow and vanished beneath the waves with hardly a splash. Hankey's men, scrambling down the ladders as the crash dive alarm howled, never imagined that a shell could follow them into their sanctuary. Yet British tests had proven otherwise. Shaped with precision and hardened for impact, the projectile cut through water as if the density were nothing more than mist. Its velocity dropped, but not enough. It tore into the submarine's pressure hull near the forward torpedo room, steel shrieking as if the ocean itself had found a voice. Fragments ricocheted through the compartment, killing 2 torpedomen instantly and wounding 3 more. A geyser of seawater and hydraulic fluid cascaded across bulkheads, flooding charts, equipment, and lives alike. Even as Hankey shouted to blow ballast, the second shell smashed into the conning tower's base, severing the periscope housing. The control room filled with a deadly spray of water and shrapnel. German doctrine had promised that the sea was armor, a shield thicker than steel. In reality, it was a trap. By diving, U-976 had only fixed herself into the Setse's sights, every meter down, drawing her closer to the lethal trajectory of incoming shells. Turner's navigator coolly called out corrections, the Mosquito holding steady as 4 more rounds thundered from the cannon in rapid succession. Within 7 minutes, what destroyers once struggled for hours to achieve with depth charges was finished. Oil and debris surfaced, spreading like ink across the waves. To Hankey's crew, still fighting in the darkness below, the truth was undeniable. The ocean had betrayed them. What they thought would save them had instead become the very medium of their destruction. The crash dive, once their greatest defense, was now their death sentence. Inside the forward compartments of U-976, panic collided with discipline. Men sealed hatches, pumped furiously, and tried to stem the torrent pouring in through ragged holes no bigger than a fist, yet lethal under pressure. The sea rushed with unstoppable weight, turning machinery into twisted wreckage and drowning shouts beneath the roar of incoming water. Hankey gripped the periscope stand, shouting orders drowned by the chaos. Blow tanks, surface, anything to bring the boat back from death. But the physics were merciless. At nearly 600 meters per second, each shell carried more force than any depth charge they had endured in 4 years of war. Destroyers had once battered submarines for hours, their patterns of explosives relying on shockwaves to crack hulls. Now, a single Mosquito round cut through 60 centimeters of seawater and 19 millimeters of hardened steel as though neither existed. In the words of one surviving officer later, "It was not a weapon, it was a verdict." Above, the Mosquito circled, its wooden fuselage glinting in broken sunlight. Turner and his navigator watched the oil slick widen, the sheen on the surface mixed with shards of debris. Radio messages confirmed. Target destroyed. In 7 minutes, the engagement was over, the sea marked by black stains and the last desperate bubbles of a crew betrayed by their training. For those trapped below, the most terrifying realization came not from the wounds or the flooding, but from the shattering of faith. Crash diving had always been survival. From 1939 to 1943, it had been doctrine, salvation, certainty. Now it was suicide. The British had proven beyond doubt that the sea no longer protected. It killed. Word of U-976's destruction spread quickly through the pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Submariners gathered in dim barracks, whispering about a new British weapon that struck from above and followed them beneath the waves. Official bulletins tried to mask the truth, describing the loss as unconfirmed enemy action. But the survivors told a different story. Cannon shells punching through the hull underwater, men torn apart in seconds, compartments flooding before anyone could reach the escape hatches. German naval doctrine had promised certainty. Water as armor, density as protection. Engineers insisted that no projectile could remain stable more than a few centimeters below the surface. Yet, here was evidence to the contrary, undeniable and deadly. Survivors spoke of the attack lasting less than 7 minutes, of the submarine shredded before it could even reach periscope depth. The crash dive, once drilled as salvation, had become a trap. At U-boat command in Paris, officers studied the reports with disbelief. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggeration born of trauma, insisting that U-976 had struck a mine or been finished by depth charges. Others warned that the British had achieved something unimaginable, a gun that made the sea transparent. Admiral Dönitz himself demanded technical confirmation, unwilling to believe that the very foundation of his submarine war, the sanctuary of depth, had been stripped away. But along the Atlantic coast, among crews preparing for patrol, belief no longer mattered. Rumors spread of a death zone from the surface to 30 meters, where survival was impossible if the tsetse Mosquito appeared. Men who had once climbed eagerly to their posts on the conning tower now scanned the skies with dread. They realized too late that every Mosquito shell was a death sentence, and the ocean, their trusted ally, had turned against them. Through the spring of 1944, British Coastal Command refined the art of the tsetse strike. Crews practiced the 30-degree dive from 1,500 meters, rehearsing until their approach was as precise as mathematics. The navigator called out range, speed, and angle, while the pilot kept the nose steady, knowing that one mistake could scatter shells wide. When executed perfectly, the first round struck the exact point where the conning tower met the pressure hull, the nerve center of the U-boat. German intelligence analysts, intercepting fragments of Allied reports, struggled to believe what they read. Descriptions of a single Mosquito destroying a submarine in minutes contradicted every principle they trusted. Destroyers carried racks of depth charges, aircraft dropped dozens of bombs, yet the British claimed that one fighter with one gun could accomplish the same in a fraction of the time. In interrogation rooms, captured RAF crews calmly explained the 57mm Moulins cannon, an anti-tank gun mated to an autoloader designed by a cigarette machine company. German engineers scoffed, dismissing it as propaganda. But patrol logs told another story. Convoys reported U-boats destroyed without prolonged depth charge barrages. Survivors spoke of shells slamming through bulkheads before they could equalize pressure. Pilots noted oil slicks spreading across the Bay of Biscay within minutes of attack. The evidence was mounting, even as the staff at BDU headquarters clung to disbelief. Among U-boat crews, there was no doubt. They named the new threat Die Todeszone, the death zone. It stretched from the surface down to periscope depth, a corridor where the sea offered no shelter. What once took hours of relentless hunting by corvettes and destroyers, the Mosquito could achieve in 7 minutes. For the men who sailed out of Saint-Nazaire, Brest, and Lorient, every patrol began with a silent question. Would they be given more than 18 seconds to live once the wooden killer appeared overhead? German reaction moved through the familiar stages of shock, denial, outrage, frantic improvisation. At the Admiralty staffs and naval yards, the initial reports of U-976's loss were read as if they were mistakes. An unlucky mine, a rare lucky shot from an escort, until the pattern could no longer be ignored. Reconnaissance photographs showed the characteristic circular entry holes in pressure hulls. Diver reports confirmed beveled penetrations, consistent with armor-piercing projectiles, rather than concussion damage. The science could not be argued away. Debriefings in the dark rooms of BDU produced angry arguments and tired calculations. Engineers who had spent careers measuring hydrodynamic resistance now found themselves asked to explain why a 6 lb hardened projectile could maintain stability through 6 decimeters of seawater. Paper upon paper attempted to prove the impossible, that the British had somehow cheated physics. Technical annexes argued over velocity loss curves, ogive shapes, and the metallurgy of hardened cores, while operational officers demanded fingered diagrams showing exactly how long, in seconds, lookouts had to spot an incoming Mosquito and give the crash dive order. The number haunted the staff. 18 seconds. 18 seconds between a shouted sighting and a shell finding its mark. Field responses were contradictory and desperate. Some commanders ordered extended surface transits by night, insisting darkness reduced detection. Others forbade daytime surfacing within known patrol lanes, routing boats through deeper water and channeling them far offshore, where, in theory, more water would mean more protection. Yet every adjustment collided with reality. The Tsetsi's range and accuracy made proximity almost irrelevant, and time the true enemy. The sub that attempted to steam for safety found that every extra meter underwater only shortened the time to impact. The very act of diving turned sanctuary into coffin. Technical proposals ranged from feasible to fantastical. Armoring of conning towers was considered, then rejected as impractical. Extra plate would raise displacement, slow diving times, and create new structural stresses that risked catastrophic failure at depth. Reactive armor, sacrificial outer skins, even discontinuous ballast schemes that might deflect a projectile were sketched in frantic notebooks and then deemed impossible given wartime resources. One junior engineer suggested a torpedo tube-mounted anti-aircraft battery to deter low attackers. He was quietly reassigned. The truth settled in like frost. There was no armor that could be fitted in time that would restore the sanctuary of seawater. Psychology became the next casualty. Veteran commanders admitted in private logs that training which once gave confidence now felt like a countdown to doom. Men measured the interval between sighting and impact obsessively. One glance at the sky, a head turned, a shouted warning, and the clock started ticking. 18 seconds was long enough to curse, to flash a final command, to hope for miracle. It was not long enough to save a boat from a shell engineered to make the ocean transparent. The death zone had rearranged every habit of submarine warfare, turning centuries of maritime doctrine into a brittle list of hazards rather than certainties. By mid-1944, the Bay of Biscay had transformed from a transit corridor into a killing ground. Coastal command patrols roamed in pairs, one Mosquito diving in for the shot, while the other orbited to spot fall of shell and cover against flak. What had once been a predictable duel, submarine versus aircraft, depth charges versus evasive maneuvers, was now an execution measured in minutes. U-boat lookouts, straining against binoculars on salt-stung bridges, knew the arithmetic by heart. From the first speck on the horizon, 18 seconds to dive. From the howl of claxons to the rush of water over the deck, perhaps 12. Then the shells would come, cutting through 60 centimeters of seawater as if it were thin mist, striking with more certainty than any pattern of depth charges. Veterans who had endured hours of destroyer attacks confessed they preferred the old ordeal. A day of pounding offered at least the chance of escape. The Mosquito's 57mm cannon offered none. In Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and La Palisse, the rumors thickened into legend. Crews whispered of the Holzhammer, the wooden hammer, whose sting could split steel. They told stories of oil slicks that spread within minutes, of comrades surfacing through torpedo hatches into seas already black with fuel. The term Todeszone entered the sailor's slang, an unscientific but brutally accurate definition of the space between surface and safety, where no man could expect to live. German counter-tactics faltered. Flak guns mounted on bridges jammed at steep angles, their tracers falling harmlessly short. Luftwaffe cover dwindled as fuel shortages grounded fighters. And still, the Tsetsis came, their wooden frames shrugging off light hits, their cannons firing with the cold rhythm of machinery, designed not for intimidation, but for annihilation. Each patrol written into the logbooks of 248 Squadron added another line to the quiet verdict. The U-boat arm was bleeding out beneath weapons it had refused to believe in. By the summer of 1944, the psychological toll reached a breaking point. Medical officers stationed at the French Pence began reporting a new condition among submarine crews. Mücken angst, Mosquito fear. Men twitched at distant engine sounds, mistook fishing boats for patrol aircraft, and demanded to dive at the slightest glimmer of sunlight on the horizon. Commanders wrote in war diaries that discipline was unraveling, not from lack of courage, but from the certainty that no drill could defeat the 18-second window. Patrols became acts of ritual. Crews painted talismans on conning towers, charms against the wooden hunters that circled unseen above the clouds. Some carried pocket stopwatches, clicking them during exercises as if timing themselves might add precious seconds. Yet everyone knew the truth. The Mosquito sting arrived faster than habit, training, or superstition could answer. Operational statistics deepened the dread. Reports from BDU showed boats vanishing without prolonged contact. No sonar traces, no prolonged chases, just sudden silence and oil on the surface. Destroyers sent to investigate often found nothing but fragments of timber or cloth. evidence that the victims had never reached depth at all. The term death corridor spread among sailors. The Bay of Biscay itself had become a zone of execution. Its waters turned transparent to British gunnery. In Berlin, naval planners still tried to impose logic. They demanded countermeasures, thicker hull plating, new crash dive procedures, fighter escorts at all hours. But resources dwindled, and the war's pace moved faster than design bureaus could draw diagrams. For the men who sailed, theory offered no refuge. Each time the klaxon wailed and the submarine tilted down into the Atlantic, they understood that the very act of diving might deliver them straight into the path of an armor-piercing shell. The sea, once their protector, had become their betrayer. Autumn 1944, and the transformation of submarine warfare was undeniable. The Mosquito Tsetse no longer represented an experimental threat, but a perfected weapon. Its 57mm shells had rewritten the calculus of survival, erasing the old certainty that the ocean offered refuge. For U-boat crews, every patrol now carried an unspoken equation. Sighting plus dive equaled death within minutes. Allied records told the story in cold precision. 7 submarines destroyed outright, 11 more crippled beyond repair, dozens forced back to port trailing oil and blood. Yet the raw numbers told only half the tale. The greater effect was paralysis. Boats once bold enough to surface under cover of night now clung to shallow waters, moving at crawl speed on batteries. Entire wolf packs dispersed, unwilling to mass where one tsetse sweep could annihilate them. German diaries captured the despair. "The sea is no shield," one officer wrote after surviving a failed patrol. "It betrays us. Depth no longer means safety. It is only the path to drowning." Sailors referred to the Mosquito not as an aircraft, but as a judgment, a force that appeared without warning and pronounced a sentence no man could overturn. Crash dive drills, once sources of confidence, became nightmares. 18 seconds of rushing water and clanging metal that ended, more often than not, in silence. Even hardened veterans felt the shift. Men who had endured years of convoy battles confessed that they feared the Mosquito more than destroyers, aircraft, or mines. Destroyers could be evaded, mines avoided, aircraft outflown. But the 57mm cannon turned every surface into a potential grave. The death zone was no longer rumor. It was doctrine, inscribed not in manuals, but in the oil slicks drifting across the Bay of Biscay. Winter 1944 settled over the Atlantic with storms and iron-gray skies, but even the weather could not hide the new reality. The U-boat arm, once the spearhead of German strategy, now crept through its own patrol lanes like hunted animals. Every dive was haunted by the image of shells cutting through seawater as if it were air. At BDU headquarters, officers tried to maintain morale with promises of new technologies: the snorkel to allow submerged running, radar detectors to warn of aircraft, heavier flak on conning towers. But the crews had lost faith. They had seen with their own eyes that no snorkel could stop a 57mm shell. No detector could stretch 18 seconds into safety. In letters home, sailors wrote in muted tones, describing not victories, but fear of the wooden aircraft with a sting sharper than torpedoes. British crews, meanwhile, perfected their craft. Training films showed how to time the dive, how to walk tracer fire across the water before loosing a cannon round, how to bracket the predicted path of a crash-diving submarine. Pilots spoke of it clinically, yet they understood the scale of what they had achieved. In minutes, a Mosquito could do what destroyers once attempted for hours, stripping away the U-boat's only real defense. By year's end, even Dönitz privately admitted the shift. In staff notes, he scrawled the words, "The enemy has made the sea transparent." For a navy built on the certainty that water was armor, this was more than a technical defeat. It was a philosophical collapse. The doctrine of the deep had been broken, and with it, the last confidence of the men who sailed into the Atlantic under a sky they no longer trusted. Spring 1945, and the collapse of the U-boat war was plain to every commander who still tried to send boats into the Atlantic. The pens at Lorient, Brest, and Bergen echoed less with the clatter of confident crews and more with the silence of men who knew they were being asked to sail into a death corridor. Rumors of the Mosquito's 57mm gun no longer needed exaggeration. Wreck after wreck proved the weapon's efficiency beyond argument. Allied patrol records described engagements lasting minutes, not hours. Pilots noted how submarines dove at the first alarm, only to be torn open seconds later by shells that turned their sanctuary into a grave. Each attack repeated the same pattern: lookouts cry, klaxon, steep dive, then impacts punching through steel and water alike. Survivors who managed to escape through forward hatches told interrogators the same story. Crash diving had become suicide. Inside Germany, desperation spawned wild countermeasures. Design bureaus sketched armored towers, decoy snorkels, even proposals for explosive nets to deflect shells. None progressed beyond paper. The Reich no longer had the steel, fuel, or time. In the meantime, crews were ordered to exercise greater vigilance, words that mocked the 18 seconds they truly had. The cumulative effect was devastating. Submarines that once prowled boldly now clung to coasts or refused to sail. Convoy lanes grew quiet, not because the Allies had destroyed every U-boat, but because fear had done what depth charges and corvettes never could: paralyze the fleet. The men who had once believed the ocean itself was their armor now sailed with the knowledge that the sea had been weaponized against them, and that every ripple overhead might hide a Mosquito with its cannon already aimed. By April 1945, the U-boat fleet was a shadow of its former self. The pens at Saint-Nazaire stood half empty, their massive concrete roofs protecting nothing but idle hulks. Crews no longer believed in victory. They believed only in survival, and even that seemed a lie whispered to keep them boarding. The wooden-winged Mosquito had destroyed more than submarines. It had destroyed the very faith that diving meant safety. On patrol logs, the pattern was monotonous. Boats reported aircraft sightings, attempted dives, and then silence. Rescue vessels arrived to find only slicks of oil and a few floating bodies. Some entries lasted less than 10 minutes, a cruel contrast to the hours-long hunts of earlier years. The Royal Air Force called it efficiency. German survivors called it inevitability. Among the sailors, the fear was given names. Der Todesstreifen, the death strip, described the invisible barrier between surface and 30 meters, where shells struck with certainty. Some called it Die Glaserne See, the glass sea, mocking the old doctrine that water was armor. In the ready rooms, new recruits listened to veterans whispering of comrades torn apart by cannon fire before they even cleared the bridge hatch. No manual could erase the terror written in those voices. The Mosquito Tsetse had done what no destroyer flotilla or corvette squadron had achieved. It had rewritten submarine warfare, proving that the ocean itself could no longer be trusted as a shield. And for the men still ordered into the Atlantic, each departure felt less like a mission and more like a death march. 18 seconds away from judgment, once the engines of a wooden killer droned overhead. May 1945, and the final act of the U-boat war was closing under the shadow of the Mosquito. In the fjords of Norway and the shattered ports of France, dozens of submarines remained trapped, their crews unwilling to sail. The surrender orders would soon formalize what every submariner already knew: the Atlantic had become impassable. For years the creed had been simple: dive and live. Crash below periscope depth, and the sea itself would shield you from bombs, rockets, and shells. That creed was now a bitter joke. The Moline's 57mm cannon had turned doctrine upside down. Instead of a shield, water had become a conductor, a medium that carried destruction directly into steel hulls. Captured German officers, questioned by Allied intelligence, admitted with stunned candor that they had never truly believed the reports. Even after U-976's wreck was examined, even after survivors described shells knifing through compartments, senior staff dismissed it as exaggeration. By the time they accepted the truth, it was too late. The U-boat fleet had sailed straight into a weapon it had denied into existence. Among British crews, there was grim pride. The Mosquito Tsetse had proven that technology, precision, and audacity could succeed where brute force had failed. Hours of depth charges, days of convoy hunts, all reduced to a few minutes of cannon fire. The ocean, once a sanctuary for the hunter, had become the coffin of the hunted. And in those final weeks of war, every surviving submariner understood the lesson written in oil slicks and wreckage. The sea no longer protected, it killed. Summer 1945, in the aftermath of surrender, the story of the Mosquito's 57mm cannon spread beyond the ruined pens of France and Norway. Allied investigators compiled precise data: engagement times under 10 minutes, confirmed kills achieved with only a handful of rounds, destruction that once demanded entire flotillas now carried out by a single twin-engine aircraft. In raw numbers, the Tsetse had sunk fewer boats than bombers or destroyers, yet its psychological impact was unmatched. German naval officers, forced to review their own losses, admitted that the weapon had collapsed morale more effectively than any campaign of bombs. Submariners described the constant fear, the dread silence between a lookout's shout and the first shudder of impact. They called those 18 seconds the longest eternity in the war. Historians later wrote that the Tsetse had inflicted a capability shock. It had not merely improved an old tactic, it had invalidated an entire doctrine. For the Allies, the lesson was equally profound. A single innovation, the marriage of an anti-tank gun to a fast, maneuverable aircraft, had transformed the sea into hostile ground for submarines. The Mosquito had broken the illusion that water itself could serve as armor. In doing so, it had paved the way for a new generation of standoff weapons, where range, precision, and speed mattered more than sheer explosive weight. On the docks of Kiel, Hamburg, and Trondheim, captured crews marched past their own surrendered boats, machines once feared across the Atlantic, now lying silent under white flags. The men looked upward at skies clear of aircraft, yet still heard the phantom drone of twin engines. For them, the war had ended, but the memory endured. The sound of a Mosquito meant the sea had turned against them, and that no depth, no doctrine, no armor could ever save them again. Autumn 1945, as interrogations gave way to reflection, the U-boat force itself admitted what the wrecks had already proven. The British had won not just with numbers, but with imagination. A wooden aircraft armed with a cigarette machine autoloader and an anti-tank gun had overturned decades of naval thinking. The Moland's 57mm had done in minutes what destroyer captains once sweated to accomplish in hours, and in doing so, it had rewritten the meaning of submarine warfare. In Allied reports, the phrase appeared again and again: capability-breaking weapon. It was not simply better than depth charges, it made depth charges obsolete. German analysts, poring over fragments of recovered shells, realized too late that shape, velocity, and hardened steel had defeated the very principle they had trusted since 1939. Water is armor, they had said. The Mosquito proved water was a killing ground. For submarine crews, the legacy was more personal. Letters written after captivity spoke of nightmares filled with engine drones and 18-second countdowns. Men remembered how quickly confidence had evaporated, how doctrines drilled into them for years collapsed in a single dive. They had believed in the ocean's embrace. They emerged knowing it had betrayed them. Historians later marked the Setse as more than a tactical success. It was a harbinger, a glimpse of warfare where precision and innovation shattered the strongest traditions. Just as radar had made night transparent, the 57mm cannon had made the sea itself transparent. And in that transformation lay the true defeat of the U-boat arm, not just in wreckage rusting on the seabed, but in the destruction of the very idea that a submarine could ever again be safe beneath the waves. Winter 1945, the war over, but its lessons still raw. Naval architects across the world studied the case of the Mosquito Tsetse. Reports circulated through London, Washington, and even Tokyo, dissecting how a single airframe had undone decades of submarine doctrine. The conclusion was stark. Survival beneath the surface could no longer be guaranteed by depth alone. In Germany's shattered shipyards, officers walked among surrendered boats, tracing the neat holes cut by 57mm rounds. Some still shook their heads, muttering that such a thing was impossible, even as their hands touched the steel scars. Survivors testified that the cannon had reduced their training to mockery, that 18 seconds was never enough. One captain admitted, "We died before we even reached safety. The ocean became our executioner." For the Allies, the achievement was both tactical and symbolic. The Setsa had proven that ingenuity could outweigh mass, that a single innovation could collapse an enemy strategy built on thousands of tons of steel. Destroyers and corvettes had worn the U-boats down, but the Mosquito had broken their spirit. In 7 minutes, it accomplished what had once taken squadrons days of relentless pursuit. And so, the legacy hardened into doctrine. Submariners of the future would design thicker hulls, snorkels, and new countermeasures, yet all with the memory that the sea was no longer untouchable. The Mosquito had shattered the illusion of sanctuary, proving that even the depths could be pierced. In the end, it was not just a weapon, but a verdict. Every shell fired from its 57mm gun carried the message that the age of invulnerable submarines had ended forever.